All right. Hey there, everybody. It's Dr. J, and welcome to our next module, Module 2. I want to make sure that I come on here and give you a good overview of what we're going to be learning so that we can all be on the same page. I'm going to start by first going to my course. I'm going to go to the home page. If for some reason this link is not working, which I think this link is not, I'm going to go through my modules manually. I'm going to go straight to week 2. Okay. Now we're going to begin week 2. First and foremost, this course is about the story of African American people when they came to the United States during the colonial period and all the way up into the Civil War period. Okay, so the colonial period is marked by the era with the 13 colonies. All right, the colonial period is also kind of marked at 1619. So when we measure time, that would technically be the 17th century. So in order to understand how we got to this point where Africans were coming over during the transatlantic slave trade, you want to first go back. You want to go back just a couple of hundred years prior, and you want to get an understanding of what Africa was really like, of what Africans were like, of what life was like for many people. Okay, and so in the nutshell, we go back to the story of Mansa Musa, which is just in the 14th, 15th century. All right, now Mansa Musa is a very powerful person and considered to be one of the richest men in the world still to this day. Okay, now Mansa Musa, his contribution to this story is that when Mansa Musa takes his Hajj, and you'll learn what a Hajj is later as you go through the PowerPoint, he essentially exposes the world to the wealth of Africa. He gives out so much gold, in fact, in Egypt, that he decreases the value of gold and disrupts their whole economic system. And so there's a moment where the world had never seen wealth at this caliber before. Mansa Musa introduces the world to this type of wealth. And shortly after that, Europeans specifically started to wonder, where all this money come from? Where is he getting all this? And they began the search, the exploration for this gold, for these resources, for this wealth, for these riches. Human trafficking becomes the result of that. Okay, so what am I saying? That Mansa Musa, some people will say, exposed the world to the wealth of Africa. The Europeans start a journey to now find, where is this kingdom? Where are these kingdoms from? And they begin a search, not only in Africa, but also in South America as well. And eventually they find the wealth that they're looking for. And what do they do when they find it? They start to take it. Okay, and that's the short of the story. The transatlantic slave trade is a very interesting and very complicated time of history, because slavery was very normalized. Everybody participated in slavery. Slavery was not the slavery that we know of today. In fact, the one thing that I always encourage you to think about is that the one big difference between slavery of the past and slavery after the European began into the slave trade is the dehumanization of people and the influx of racism and white supremacy. People started to say, no, you're supposed to be a slave because you're Black, or because you're African, or because you're dark skinned. But see, that was racist. Before, anybody could be a slave. The white folks were slaves, Irish people were slaves, Polish people were slaves, poor people were slaves. There were all types of different of slaves, all right? And so slavery was very normalized, but the racism, the white supremacist attitude, the audacity and supremacy that many of the European nations started to embody is going to exacerbate the humanity of the slave trade, and it's going to make it extremely dehumanizing. And so the slavery that we see now is the version that has become the more consistent narrative of what slavery is. Okay, now in the course of the trafficking of African bodies, there are literally going to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who are going to be transported illegally from the continent of West Africa to more interestingly, not to North America, but first to South America. And so you start to get more understanding of why there are so many African people in Cuba, in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Peru, in Argentina, in Honduras, in Mexico. And this is largely because of the transatlantic slave trade, although many of our ancestors were already there in these nations prior to the transatlantic slave trade as well. Now we continue our journey as we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, which we also refer to as the MAAFA, which is a Kiswahili word that means the great disaster. And that word was given to us by a wonderful scholar by the name of Dr. Marimba Ani. But one of the things that we don't really hear too much about is the atrocities that existed on the slave journeys, on these enslavement adventures, is the egregiousness of the captains. Sometimes the goal was not to necessarily keep the bodies of these African peoples healthy and well so that they can one day work a plantation. Some people really looked at these people as property and a business, and they found a variety of ways to make money off of this business. And one of the most horrible ways that we see is through the story of the Zong. And I'm not going to tell you the entire story, but essentially enslaved Africans were killed for insurance money. Okay. And so this is a horrible story, but a story that I think we all need to know about existed, because it really speaks to the complicated dynamic reality of how many people were involved with slavery. It wasn't just the slave owners, it was the slave catchers, it was the people who are the bankers who are loaning the money to the ship adventures and these voyages that they're embarking on. It's the people who are giving the money to the plantation owners to buy the actual land, the plantation, to build the house and to rent the farm tools. I mean, the industry of slavery is literally a big, huge business. And of course, as we talk about the history of African people in the United States of America, from the colonial period all the way up into the Civil War period, you're talking about a continuous spirit of resistance. From the moment that African people were literally put into chains, from the literally to now, you could say that we have been fighting for our liberation and for our freedom from the very beginning of our colonization. And so again, I introduce you to the term MAAFA because there are so much of our stories that are embodied within this great disaster that some will say it is the biggest atrocity that human history has seen. There's no atrocity that has been as intense and as devastating to the world. And so I give you the information of Dr. Marimba Ani directly. This is a lecture that she's done from Howard University. And again, she gave us the term MAAFA. She's a very powerful, very brilliant scholar. And for those of you who are able, I would really love for you to watch these videos. These videos are not necessarily mandatory because I can't closed caption them. But if you turn on the closed caption feature on your computer, which I have a video here that shows you how to do that, then you will literally be able to get the closed captioning feature automatically, okay? And it's pretty solid. It's pretty solid, okay? So please consider that, you guys. I really hope that you can take the time to watch these videos as best as you can, okay? And if I really wanted to get fancy, I would make it big. I would make it big and then I could watch it like that, okay? So check that video out. That's a really cool video from Dr. Marimba Ani, who is still alive and does an amazing job keeping the spirit of our ancestors still going. She does a really, really powerful festival every year called Abaka Sum Sum. And it's a celebration of African warriorhood and the spirit of our fight for freedom. Okay. So once Africans finally got to the United States, and again, it was a process. They first had to be seasoned and broken in the Caribbean and in South America. And then eventually they were put on slave ships to be brought to North America. And so I introduced to you two men that really complicate what life was like during the colonial period for African people, because what's interesting, and one of the things that we have to talk about, is the diversity of African people during the colonial period. Everybody wasn't just a slave. Some people were coming over here as workers. Some people were coming over here as professionals. Some people were coming over here because they already had family that was here. And some people came over here absolutely in chains, okay? But you have a variety of types of African people living in this land all at the same time. And so colonial projects started to also begin to try to organize all of these different types of African people, because they wanted to consolidate them into being one group, one category, one kind of superficial racial station of just slave. Okay, and so I introduce you to the first to these two first men, John Punch and John Castor, who are some of the pioneering men that come on to the colonial period as and eventually are going to be put into enslavement. Again, African people came over here in a variety of capacities. One of the most interesting things that you see, though, as we continue with this particular page, is that you see that some of the Africans came over as interpreters. Now, how is it that an African person will be able to come with Spanish conquistadors as interpreters to this new land? Well, there's an obvious understanding. They already knew the language. So how is it that they knew the language? Again, there's several researchers and several historical journals and things that are starting to come out that are now recognizing that many of our ancestors were already in community with one another. Who we weren't in community with necessarily was the European, and that was for certain geological restriction reasons, not necessarily because of any reason in terms of ostracizing them for any other human ailment or issue or anything than that. Okay, and so the what am I saying? I'm saying that many of the people that were already in this land were African people and African centered people, or people who came from an African origin, people who came from an African mother language, mother tongue, mother culture. And you'll see that if you really start to investigate what life was like for many societies before the European came and colonized them. Many of our ancestors looked the same, many of them lived the same, many of them worshiped nature, and many of them had a very great relationship with earth that allowed them to have thriving kingdoms for thousands of years. And so you see that the Africans in the colonial period, again, are going to be put in a very complicated, very dynamic, very controversial reality. Because of this, we're going to see also the imposition of slave codes. Now, slave codes is the moment of them trying to regulate the different varieties of African people existing at the same time. You have free people, you have interpreters, you have professionals, you have enslaved people, you have indentured servants, you have white indentured servants, you have so many different things going on that we're starting to try to get some order to this thing. And so they implement slave codes, and these slave codes are designed to literally regulate Black bodies, so that if you are Black, the first assumption is that you are a slave. Because again, white supremacy assumes that racism means that you're less than a human being, and so you're meant to be a slave. And because of that designation, now you're going to have laws specific to you as a slave. And so again, turn on the closed caption feature of your computer if you can, and watch this really cool brief overview of what slave codes are, because we're going to later write about that in our essay for the module. Now we get into more content of what slave codes are. Virginia is one of the first colonies in the colonial period, Virginia. And so many of us come from Virginia. Many of our ancestors come from Virginia, okay? But those of us who can look at the impact of Virginia and the role of Virginia, we can look at slave codes through the lens of the Virginia lawmaking government, okay? And so I want to bring this article to you so that not only you can investigate what Virginia had to offer, but you can start to really understand the thinking about these slave codes, the design of them, and why they were really a thing at the time. And Virginia wasn't the only one to have slave codes. You also see slave codes in New York and Pennsylvania and several colonies throughout the colonial period. And so as we close out this particular module, I want you to take a deep breath, and I want you to think about, especially after you have watched the lecture from Dr. Marimba Ani and her talking about the impact and the effects of the MAAFA on African people. And one of the things that she talks about is the effect on our spirituality. And so please check that video out. And I want you to think about what she says, and how do you see the connections between racism in spirituality. And again, kind of reflect on what Dr. John Henry Clark said in the first module when we talked about the Nicene Conference and these European leaders literally taking the faces of the African popes and replacing them with white faces. So what also happens when you are replacing the gods that used to look like you with gods that look very foreign to you, gods of your oppression? That is a very interesting kind of disconnection as well in terms of what is the impact of enslavement, especially when we think about our mind spiritually. And I just want to encourage everybody, whatever you believe in spiritually is your business, but whoever you pray to should really look like you, should be a reflection of who you are. And so now we get into our first essay. I want to first start off by saying that this essay is a very easy essay as long as you know what you're doing. So the first thing that you need to make sure of is by looking at the rubric. I'm going to be grading you on 3 primary areas: your thesis statement, your essay structure, and your format. Your thesis statement needs to provide a very clear response to the essay prompt, and you need to introduce 3 supporting details to the essay. Okay, so say for instance, I ask you, do you think Christian Rock should keep her baby? Yes or no? Well, you're going to say, I think Christian Rock should keep her baby because I think she's a new mother who's learning, because I think that so many different mothers should have a right to experience motherhood. There's some women that never get to experience that. And I think that for the most part, she's not that bad of a mom, and she is going to grow into her position. So yes, I think that Christian Rock should be able to keep her baby. So I answered the question and I gave you 3 distinct reasons. And I want you to do that with this essay. And then I want you to think about your essay structure. Whatever your 3 supporting details are, your body paragraph should then flush those things out in detail. So if I said Christian Rock is a young mother, but she's made mistakes that she shouldn't be penalized for. If that was my first supporting detail, then I'm going to go into more detail of that in my first body paragraph. And so I'm going to get into maybe conversations about young motherhood. I'm going to get into the common mistakes young mothers make. I'm going to get into maybe some statistics about young mothers who overcome those mistakes. I'm going to give you some more sustenance in terms of that first supporting detail of my thesis statement. And I'm going to continue to do that for each one of those 3. That's going to give me the body paragraph of my essay. Okay, so my thesis statement, and then my 3 body paragraphs, and then lastly, my conclusion. My conclusion is going to summarize everything up, and it's going to give me the opportunity to give my personal opinion. Okay, when I put all of that stuff together, I'm going to put a works cited page on the back of it and make sure that each one of these works cited page references are APA cited. Okay, and then I'm also going to make sure I have 2 pages and that there's 12-point font and it's Times New Roman. If you do all of that, then you're going to get full credit. Okay, and if for some reason you don't, then you'll see the area that I will be deducting you in. Okay, so what is this essay about? Why did slave codes change the course of history? And I want you to think about it. Slave codes changed the course of history because African people in the colonial period were doing X, Y, and Z. This is the first time we see the colonial government try to regulate Black bodies. And this is impacting history because we know that the story of African people is not going to get any easier from that moment forward. Okay, so you might want to talk about what things stand out to you that make these slave codes so impactful to the lives of African people. All right, now that essay is also going to be peer reviewed. What does that mean? That means that each one of you will be given a assigned person. Okay, and that person, as you guys can kind of see, some of your names are already here. That assigned person is going to take the time to look at your work before you turn it in. Okay, this is just an opportunity for you to have a second set of eyes. This is not a penalty thing. This is not going to cause you any problems if you don't do it. But I do want you guys to interact with one another. And I do want this to be an opportunity for you to get another set of eyes to look at your work before I grade you. Okay, so take a second and check who you're assigned to, and please give them some really good feedback. Okay, and then finally, and I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna help you with your writing. So I know a lot of times we're thinking that, oh my God, this is just extra work. You'll be able to see the writing of someone else that actually might help you think where you might not want to make the same mistake about your writing, where you might want to tighten up, or how you could just make sure that your writing is on point. So it's a twofold thing. It's gonna help you help someone else. And then the peer review will also help you kind of see what you want to write for yourself, okay? And then for those of us who are not familiar with APA format, I've given you kind of an APA guide for citations so that when you do your works cited page, you'll know exactly how to write up your resources. Those resources can be from this course, which means you can take them from our actual course modules. Those resources can also be from online, and there's websites, informations, and there's website information to show you how to write that up as well, okay? Now that brings us to the end of module 2. So again, thank you for your patience. If there is anything that you all need, please give me 24 to 36 hours to respond to your emails. I do have virtual office hours, so if you need to meet with me, just let me know. And if you have any issues or any questions or any concerns about this essay, don't freak out, don't panic, I got your back. We'll be able to do it and it'll be fine. So just reach out and let me know if you have any questions, concerns, or any kind of issues with the essay, okay? This will first be our first official assignment, and I'm looking forward to reading you guys' work, okay? Love you, bye. Take care, everybody.